Well, it is great to see everyone this morning. You know, laziness is really the bane of any theological discussion. I mean, imagine for a minute a situation where you have someone who's a skeptic. They don't believe in the Bible, but they also haven't done their own research. They maybe have watched a couple YouTube videos, maybe they've gone and read a blog post about how the Bible has loads of contradictions in it. Now, on the other side of the conversation, you have someone who they are a Christian, they believe that the Bible is an error, they believe that there are no contradictions, but they also haven't done their own study. They haven't done their own research. And these two people get together, and the skeptic makes the accusation that the Bible is full of contradictions. And the other person says, well, show me one. And they say, well, there's just too many to count. Or they do give a specific example, and the Christian, they don't know how to answer it. And they sputter and they go, well, that's not a contradiction. But they can't demonstrate how. You know, we don't want to be lazy Christians. We don't want to be Christians who make a statement, make a claim, but can't back it up. And so throughout the year this year, we're doing sermons about addressing alleged contradictions. And I did one a few months ago, and throughout the year we'll have one of these interspersed. So I thought if we put them all together in one spot, we're going to get overloaded really quick, because these are honestly informationally dense sermons. So today we're addressing alleged time and genealogical contradictions. Contradictions having to do with the way that time is reckoned in the Bible and the way that genealogies are reckoned. Now, spoiler alert, they're not actually contradictions. But we need to understand how to answer these things. Now, much like the previous sermon on this, much of my information is coming from a book series by Eric Lyons titled The Anvil Rings. We have it in the church library. If you're interested in studying this topic, I'd highly recommend you go get that book series, because he does a good job answering alleged contradictions that have been made against Christians and against the Bible, and answering them in a thorough and biblical fashion. So, with that having been said, let's jump in and let's start in talking about our alleged time contradictions. Now, when we're studying contradictions or supposed contradictions, we need to understand a really basic principle. And that is that if there is one or more legitimate, non-contradictory interpretation, then there is no contradiction. There may be 2 or 3 possible answers to some of these supposed contradictions. We don't need to necessarily know exactly which one specifically is what happened. So long as we can explain that there are ways that this is not a contradiction, then, well, there is no contradiction. So, with that being said, the first question we're going to address is, did the period of the Judges really last 450 years? This goes in this way. People read Acts 13, verse 20, where Paul states that the period of the Judges was 450 years. But then, over in 1 Kings 6:1, let's go over there, 1 Kings 6:1, states that the 4th year of Solomon's reign was the 480th year after the Exodus from Egypt. Let's read this. 1 Kings 6, verse 1. Now it came about in the 480th year after the sons of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, in the month of Ziv, which is the 2nd month, that he began to build the house of the Lord. Now, the skeptics will look at this and say, okay, well, David reigned 40 years, and Saul reigned 40 years, and this is the 4th year of Solomon's reign, so there's 84 years right there. But then this other passage says that the time of the Judges was 450 years. So they say, well, there's a clear contradiction. Well, to answer this, the study and interpretation principles we need are first, context, context, context. And you're going to get tired of me saying this, but I'm going to keep saying it, because we need to remember, look at the context. We also need to understand translation variances. All right, let's get into this. So, Acts 13:20 in the King James Version, and this is important, says, "And after that he gave unto them judges about the space of 450 years, until Samuel the prophet." Reading that, the King James indicates that the time of the judges was 450 years. However, if we look at the more modern translations, like the ESV, they state, all this took about 450 years, and after that he gave them judges until Samuel the prophet. You see the difference. The ESV and the newer translations put the 450 years before the time of the judges, where the King James puts it as the time of the judges. That's a pretty big difference. So let's break down this 450 years so we can see which one is accurate. Well, Acts 7 verse 6 tells us the Hebrews were oppressed in Egypt for 400 years. Then Acts 13:18 tells us they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. So now we've got 440 years. Now, if the conquest of Canaan took about 10 years, then we arrive at 450 years before the period of the judges. Now, that fits with the more recent translations like the ESV. So, the answer to this supposed contradiction is that the translators of the King James used less reliable manuscripts which incorrectly list the 450 years as a period of the judges instead of before the period of the judges. Okay, so there's not a contradiction here. There is a translation variance. Now, side note, when we're looking at these things, don't panic when there's a translation variance. Translators are human. They make mistakes. There's also been a lot of archaeological discoveries since 1611. So, the modern translations include many more older manuscripts that are more reliable than they had in 1611 when the King James was translated. So, don't get too worried about the translation differences between the King James and the more modern translations. Okay, that first one's pretty easy to answer, pretty straightforward. Now let's look at another question. A coin called Derek. 1 Chronicles 29:7. Let's go over there. 1 Chronicles 29:7 lists that the people gave 10,000 derricks of gold for the building of the temple. Now this is during the time of King David. 29 verse 1 states that this is the time of King David when he's collecting money and materials for the building of the temple that his son Solomon is going to do. And verse 7 says, "And for the service of the house of God, they gave 5,000 talents and 10,000 derricks of gold, and 10,000 talents of silver, and 18,000 talents of brass, and 100 talents of iron." Now, where the supposed contradiction comes in is that the unit of measure of the derrick was not used during the time period of King David, which was about 970 BC. It was used during the time of the Persian Empire, which was about 515 BC. So the skeptic will look at that and say, oh, see, the people that wrote the Bible didn't know what they were talking about because they used a unit of measure that wasn't used during the time of King David's reign. So, how do we address this? Well, the principles we need, again, are, ready? Context, context, context. Pretty soon you're going to be saying it with me. Also, an understanding of the use of what's called prolepsis. Okay, what's a prolepsis? A prolepsis, well, is a anachronistic representation of something as existing before its proper or historical time. We talked about this in the last sermon I did on supposed contradictions. What that means for us here, well, the book of Chronicles was most likely compiled around 500 BC, when the derrick was common. This is not something that was written as they were doing the events. What they did when they were in exile and specifically coming back from exile is they took a lot of the oral and written histories and they compiled them so it's easy to study and teach people from. So the answer here is that the writer was not stating that the derrick was used in the time of David, but instead was using a term that his readers would be familiar with. We see this a lot. If I were to tell you that Jesus and the apostles walked 30 miles, well, I'm not creating a contradiction because they didn't use miles. I'm using a measurement that you would be familiar with. Similarly, this particular book was written for a group of people in a time period when they would have understood what a derrick was. And so for the ease of the reader, they use a unit of measure that the readers would be familiar with. You see it often in your Bibles also, in some of the newer translations, where it won't say talents, it'll say something like pounds. Well, they didn't use pounds back then, but they're using a unit of measure that you will understand. That is a prolipsis. So, 2 questions so far and 2 non-contradictions. The next question, 6 or 8 days. Here's how this supposed contradiction goes. Matthew 17:1 and Mark 9:2 state that 6 days elapsed between Jesus' statement about the establishment of the kingdom and the transfiguration. Let's go over to Matthew 17. Matthew 17, we're really going to back up to Matthew 16 and read starting in verse 27 so we get something of the context. Says 16:27, for the Son of Man is going to come the Son of Man is going to come in the glory of his Father with his angels, and will then repay every man according to his deeds. Truly I say to you, there are some of those who are standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. 6 days later, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John, his brother, and led them up on a high mountain by themselves. And he was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his garments became as white as light. So, Matthew and Mark record 6 days elapsed. However, Luke 9:28 states that about 8 days elapsed. And again, we're going to start in verse 27. Luke 9:27, but I say to you truly, there are some of those standing here who will not taste death until they see the kingdom of God. Some 8 days after these sayings, he took along Peter and John and James and went up to the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face became different, and his clothing became white and gleaming. So same events, same bit of teaching, same transfiguration, but Matthew and Mark say 6 days, Luke says 8. And so those who are skeptics say, see, clear contradiction. Well, how do we answer this? Well, the principles needed, again, ready? Context, context, context. And also an understanding of the inclusive method of reckoning time versus only counting complete days. Let's get into this just a little bit. In Luke 9:28, Luke states now about 8 days after these sayings. He's not indicating that exactly 192 hours elapsed. Instead, he's estimating the time. We do this all the time when we say about. Well, I was there for about 3 hours. Well, what if you were there for 2 hours and 46 and a half minutes? Did you lie? No, you were estimating. Similarly, he says about 8 days. Also, he uses what's called inclusive reckoning of time, which means that the days of the 2 events are included in the count. So Jesus said his statements about the establishment of the kingdom. In this reckoning, that counts as day 1. Then 6 more days, and Jesus goes up on the mountain to pray and is transfigured. That's day 8. That's called inclusive reasoning of time, a reckoning of time. However, Matthew and Mark are only counting the full days that have elapsed and not the 2 partial days. They're only counting the days in between. The day of the sermon and the day of the transfiguration aren't included in the count. Now again, we might do this. We might say, well, I took a trip and I was there for 4 days. Well, are you counting your travel days? There are 2 half days. Now, did you lie? Well, no. You're counting time one way versus the other. Thus, only 6 days would have separated the 2 events. So the answer here is that Luke used the inclusive method of reckoning time, while the others only counted complete days. Again, no contradiction here. Just an understanding of the way time is reckoned. So far, 3 questions, and none of them are legitimate contradictions. Let's talk about one more question concerning time, and then we're going to move on to talk about genealogy. So here's the question. When did Paul go to Jerusalem? This supposed contradiction goes like this. In Acts, chapter 9, 22 through 26, chapter 22, 16 through 18, and chapter 26, 19 through 20, it states that after his conversion, Paul went from Damascus to Jerusalem. Let's just look at the Acts 9:22 passage. Acts 9, starting in verse 22. But Saul kept increasing in strength and confounding the Jews who lived at Damascus by proving that Jesus is the Christ. When many days had elapsed, the Jews plotted together to do away with him, but their plot became known to Saul. They were also watching the gates day and night so that they might put him to death. But his disciples took him by night and let him down through an opening in the wall, lowering him in a large basket. Then he came to Jerusalem, or when he came to Jerusalem, he was trying to associate with the disciples, but they were all afraid of him, not believing that he was a disciple. So that seems to indicate that he went from Damascus to Jerusalem. However, Galatians 1, 15 through 19, Paul states that he went to Arabia first, then after 3 years went to Jerusalem. Let's look at Galatians 1, starting in verse 15. Galatians 1, starting in 15. But when God, who set me apart even from my mother's womb, and called me through his grace, was pleased to reveal his Son in me, so that I might preach him among the Gentiles, I did not immediately consult with flesh and blood, nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went away to Arabia, and returned once more to Damascus. Then 3 years later, I went up to Jerusalem to become acquainted with Cephas, and stayed with him 15 days. So there, Paul very clearly states that he went to Arabia, then back to Damascus, and 3 years later went to Jerusalem. So the skeptics will say there's a contradiction here, that one says he went right to Jerusalem, the other one doesn't. So what do we need here? Well, all we really need here is context. Context and a little bit more context. Let's look at the context. In Acts, none of these passages say that Paul went directly to Jerusalem. Just that he did at some point end up in Jerusalem. In fact, the Acts 9:22 passage says that many days elapsed, many days later. Well, how much is that? Is that 4 days or is that 3 years? Both could count as many days. See, none of these passages are intended to be detailed chronological biographies. They're mentioning the events that are important to the larger narrative. Think about in chapters 22 and 26 when Paul is telling important dignitaries about his life events. He's not going to say, okay, I got baptized, and the Tuesday after I had chicken and curry, and the next day I went to this guy's house and we had a nice bit of lunch and I taught him about Jesus. And then he's not going to give every event, right? He's going to give the highlights, the things that are really important. I was baptized. I went to Jerusalem. I went to this next place, right down the line. He's not going to give every single event. However, Galatians 1, 15 through 19 is a different kind of passage. In this section, Paul is defending his apostolic mission to preach to the Gentiles. Specifically, he's demonstrating that his calling and message were directly from God and not from man. He wants to point out to them and make it very clear, he's not a copycat. He got his message, his calling, his apostleship from God. And so he makes a strong point. He didn't go to Jerusalem right away. He went to Arabia, and what was he doing there? He was probably spreading the gospel. And then he came back to Damascus and was spreading the gospel before he ever went to Jerusalem to meet the other apostles. It's a different purpose. So the answer here is that every account does not need to mention every detail. Each account mentions the details that are important for its purpose. And this is actually directly stated in John, when John makes a statement that if everything that Jesus said and did was written down, the world wouldn't be big enough to hold all the books that it would contain, it. But the things that are written for our learning, so that by believing we may have life. The things that are written are for specific purposes, not absolutely detailed chronological biographies of everything that took place. Now, we could go on and talk about more supposed time contradictions, but let's now move to talk about some alleged genealogical contradictions. I only have 3 of these for us today. First, how old was Terah when Abram was born? This supposed contradiction goes like this. Genesis 11:26 says that Terah lived 70 years and became the father of Abram. Let's read this. Genesis 11:26. And we read, Terah lived 70 years and became the father of Abram, Nahor, and Haran. Okay, 70 years, then he becomes a father of these 3 guys. However, Acts 7:4 says that Abraham left Haran after Terah died. Genesis 11:32 says that Terah was 205 when he died. But then Genesis 12:4 says that Abraham was 75 when he left Haran. Now we do a little bit of quick math. 205 minus 75. Terah should have been 130 when Abram was born, not 70. And so a skeptic looks at this and they say, hey, one passage says he was 70 when Abram was born, but doing the math on the other dates given, he should have been 130. So they claim contradiction. Well, to answer this, again, we need our context, but we also need to understand the wider meaning of some Hebrew phrases, along with the genealogical listing orders in Scripture. Let's dig into this. So the wider meaning of some Hebrew phrases, the birth year of the firstborn son was known as the beginning of strength. This was a very important year to the Hebrew man. Thus, the genealogy will call out the man's age when his eldest son was born. Let's look at a couple of these passages just to show you what we're talking about. Genesis 49:3. This is not dealing with Terah, but it shows this concept. 49 verse 3 says, Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might and the beginning of my strength, preeminent in dignity and preeminent in power. And then Deuteronomy 21:17, which says, but he shall acknowledge the firstborn, the son of the unloved, by giving him a double portion of all that he has, for he is the beginning of his strength. To him belongs the right of the firstborn. And again, in Psalms, we see a similar idea, though it's worded slightly differently. Psalm 78:51, which reads, and smote all the firstborn of Egypt, the first issue of their vitality in the tents of Ham. So they have this idea of the first issue of their vitality. Now, this is important to us because it's not calling out the age the father was when each child was born, just what age he was when the eldest son is born. We pair this with genealogical listing orders. In the Old Testament genealogy, the Old Testament genealogies will often list the names of the sons in order of importance, not of age. Americans, we hate this. Americans, we want everything in chronological order, time-stamped and dated. But the Hebrews, they did things differently. They would order things by importance and category. So, in this case, the Messiah would come through the line of Abram, and all the nations of the earth would be blessed through Abram. So he's listed first. He is the most prominent of the sons, according to the biblical narrative. So the sons are listed with Abram first. It's not saying that he's the firstborn son. Thus, the answer to this is that Terah was 70 when the first of his 3 sons was born. The most important of whom, not because of age, but because of the messianic line, was Abram. We don't know if Abraham was the second son or the third son, just that he was the most important in that group of 3 boys. Okay, so we're getting our feet wet with the genealogies. The next one, again, has to do with the messianic line. And the question is, well, about Ruth, David, and a Moabite mandate. We know from Ruth 4, 13 through 22, which we're not going to read through right now. We studied Ruth relatively recently. That Ruth, a Moabite woman, was the great-grandmother of King David. Okay, pretty straightforward. However, Deuteronomy 23, verse 3, states that no descendant of a Moabite to the 10th generation shall enter the assembly of the Lord. Let's go over there. Deuteronomy 23, verse 3. No Ammonite or Moabite shall enter the assembly of the Lord. None of their descendants, even to the 10th generation, shall ever enter the assembly of the Lord, because they did not meet you with food and water on the way when you came out of Egypt, and because they hired against you Balaam the son of Beor from Pethor of Mesopotamia to curse you. Okay, so the skeptic points to this and say there should be no way that David could be a king of Israel because his great-grandmother was a Moabite. He should be excluded from Israel. Well, to answer this, again, we need to look at the context. But we also need an understanding of the differences between ethnicity and religion. That should spark something right there. And also an understanding of Hebrew lineage traditions. Let's talk about the first part of this. That mandate, the mandate against Ammonites and Moabites, well, it applied to unconverted, non-circumcised, alien or foreign Moabites and Ammonites. People who were not buying into the Jewish religion. They still had their own religion. They had their own gods. They had their own culture. This is because the division and idolatry that was spread in the nation when such people were allowed to intermarry with the Hebrews. You look at that event in Exodus when they refused to let the nation of Israel in and they hire Balaam to prophesy against them. Right after that, they start enticing the people of Israel and getting them to try to marry their daughters and involve them in their idolatry. It splits the kingdom. In fact, Solomon, the thing that led him astray was that he loved many foreign women and worshipped their gods. So this was to protect the sanctity of the Jewish nation and religion. However, this restriction would not have applied to Ruth as she converted to Judaism. We see in Ruth 1, 16 through 18, she makes that famous statement to Naomi, where you go, I will go, your home will be my home, your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. We see that she becomes a faithful follower of Judaism. Ruth was ethnically a Moabite, but religiously she was a dedicated follower of Jehovah. Now, we should be familiar with the difference between someone's ethnicity and someone's religion. I mean, think about someone from Arabia nowadays. It would be disingenuous to say that everybody from Arabia is Muslim. Well, that's their choice. They can choose to be Christian or something else. Just because someone is from a particular region doesn't mean that that's their religion. We also, though, need to understand Hebrew lineage traditions. A non-Israelite mother, especially a proselyte, did not determine the nationality of the offspring. The Jewish mind counted the nationality as coming from the father, along with the family name and any inheritance. Now, just to back this up, consider Joseph's Egyptian wife. Well, Joseph's sons weren't considered Egyptian boys. They were considered each a half-tribe of Israel. Zipporah, Moses' Midianite wife, well, their sons weren't considered Midianites. Rahab, Salmon's Jerichoan wife, see, all their children were considered Hebrews because the father was a Hebrew. So the answer here is that Ruth, being from Moab, would not have excluded her great-grandson David from being part of the assembly of Israel. Okay, now we have one more question concerning genealogy we're going to talk about today, and that is, who was Abijah's grandfather? We read in 1 Kings 15, 1 and 2, states that Abijah's mother was Maacah, the daughter of Absalom. Let's go 1 Kings 15, 1 and 2. Now in the 18th year of King Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, Abijah became king over Judah. He reigned 3 years in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Maacah, the daughter of Absalom. Now, we're going to see some different spellings of these names. Don't get confused by the different spellings of the names. Between Kings and Chronicles, there was a pretty big time gap and language shift, and the spellings of some names got changed. Same names, different spelling. However, in 2 Chronicles 13, verses 1 and 2, states that Abijah's mother was Micaiah, the daughter of Uriel of Gibeah. 2 Chronicles 13, starting in 1. In the 18th year of King Jeroboam, Abijah became king over Judah. He reigned 3 years in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Micaiah, the daughter of Uriel of Gibeah. Okay, so the skeptics say 1 Kings says she was Absalom's daughter. 2 Chronicles says that she was Uriel's daughter. They say clear contradiction. Well, to answer this, we need to study the context, but also the non-literal use of Hebrew word translated daughter. Non-literal use of this word. Now, to look at this, I copied a large section from a Bible dictionary. I know the type is small, but I want to get the whole picture up there. Concerning the word daughter, besides its natural and proper sense, it's used to designate first a niece or any female descendant. Right there's our answer, but I'm going to read a few more just in case. Could also mean a woman as a native of a place or as professing the religion of a place, such as the daughters of Zion or the daughters of the Philistines. It could mean small towns and villages lying around a city were called its daughters. 4, the people of Jerusalem are spoken of as the daughters of Zion. 5, the daughters of a tree are its boughs. 6, the daughters of music are singing women. This word daughters is often used non-literally. So, saying that she is the daughter of Absalom doesn't strictly mean that she is the direct child of Absalom. So let's talk about the lineage of Micaiah to clear this up. She's most likely the granddaughter of Absalom. We know this because 2 Samuel 14:27 says that Absalom had a daughter named Tamar, who's named after his beloved sister. Tamar was most likely married to Uriel, and they were the parents of Micaiah. So it's stating that Micaiah was the daughter of Absalom, as in she was of his line, of his lineage, not that she was his direct daughter. So the answer is that Abijah's grandfather was Uriel and his great-grandfather was Absalom. Okay, so we're getting an idea on how these genealogies are worded, and it is confusing by the American mind. They don't list things the way that we would. But we also see that there are no contradictions there. So, as we've been addressing these time and genealogical contradictions, or these alleged time and genealogical contradictions, we've seen that they do take quite a bit of study. They take some digging and some understanding of some pretty unique wording. But we also see that there are no contradictions. And that's what we discover. When we dig into any of these supposed contradictions, we find that there are not actually any contradictions in the Bible. So, with that in mind, let's devote the time to study out these supposed contradictions so that they don't shake our faith. You're going to have people who throw these supposed contradictions at you. They're going to tell you there's thousands of contradictions in the Bible. They may even throw specific instances at you. And you may not know the answers right off the top of your head. Some of these supposed contradictions are so incredibly detailed and seemingly small that you may not know the answers off the top of your head. Don't let that shake your faith, but be willing to do the legwork, to dig in and find the answer. Your faith will be strengthened for it. Now today, as we're closing out our sermon time, maybe you have had your faith shaken. Maybe you're questioning your faith, or you've been in some situation that has caused you to struggle. We want to be here for you. We want to support you and encourage you. And when we have our invitation song, I encourage you to come up to the front. One of the elders will come speak with you. Maybe you find yourself wanting to learn more about salvation. Maybe you're ready to be baptized into Christ. We want to help you with that. We want to teach you and facilitate that learning opportunity. So if you have a need, whatever your need may be, please let it be known as we're led in our invitation song.
Thank you for watching. For a deeper study of God's Word, contact us through our website in the description of this video. Lakes Region Church of Christ invites you and your family to Bible classes for all ages on Sunday morning, and join us for worship. We also offer other scheduled Bible classes. See you soon.